Boston College. And 20 years ago, this month, I was completing my doctorate in psychology and religion here at Harvard, at the Church of the Covenant, and been one of the Protestant chaplains here at Harvard, and been one. You may understand why a colleague of mine says that Rick is one of the 3 finest preachers in the city of Boston. You can guess the other 2. There's another man whose broken heart has produced wisdom that has nourished many folks, also a Presbyterian. His little book of prayers for gay and lesbian people, I used to buy 5 copies at a time from Matthew Sheehan and pass them out to students of mine. He is now the editor in Atlanta of a resource for the congregations that attempt to create space for gay and lesbian people. He's Chris Glaser and a personal hero. And so, Chris, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks. What a treat, 2 Presbyterians in a row. Oh boy, oh boy. I think I stand with Simone Weil on the threshold of the church right now. That's where I am right now, and probably where I've been all along. She didn't want to go inside and become a full-fledged Catholic because she loved so much outside the church, and I'm the same way. And yet she did embrace many of the values that she shared with the church. I've been involved in this for 25 years. I was on the Presbyterian Task Force to study homosexuality as the token openly gay member of the task force. We couldn't get a lesbian on the task force. They thought, one gay person wasn't enough. But another one did come out in the process of our work, and we recommended favorably in terms of ordination of gay and lesbian Presbyterians, bisexuals, and transgendered who were not part of the conversation, unfortunately, then. And our recommendation was denied, but because Presbyterians are not afraid to be inconsistent, I was given a job anyway, and I was founding director of the Lazarus Project, which was a ministry of reconciliation between the church and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and now transgendered communities, and which is still in operation, and I was there for 10 years before beginning writing books and doing other things. Over the past 25 years, I've used different reasons for staying there. Things like, well, I don't want to let the Presbyterians off the hook. Even if I left the Presbyterian Church right in the time that I'm speaking to you, there are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered Presbyterians being born into the Presbyterian Church, and therefore I feel compelled to stay. Presbyterians are not afraid to be inconsistent, as I said, welcoming us as members, and yet not ordaining us as pastors if we are openly gay or lesbian. I also have made a little joke about being a professional victim. As a friend of mine said, gee, if the ordination came through, you'd be out of a job, because that's what you do. You go around and talk about the injustice of the church in this issue. I've said that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people serve as an occasion for the church to deal with issues of sexuality and spirituality and gender nonconformity. And I've said that I have to be forgiving of a body, the body of Christ, just as I need to be forgiven for not being all that I am capable of being. So I need to exercise forgiveness of the body of which I'm part. My strategy has been to argue for the acceptance of homosexuality on the same basis as the church accepts heterosexuality. Then, I've said, together we can dialogue on marriage and monogamy, sexual relationships outside of committed relationships, open and closed relationships. Because I see a spectrum of varying responses to sexual expression among straights, lesbians, gay men, and bisexual women and men. And I don't, as a gay man, like serving as a kind of whipping boy for straight society that doesn't have its act together in terms of honesty about sexuality and their own sexual relationships. So I've always differentiated the issues about the acceptance of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people within the church. And while I'm perceived as a moderate, and I do think of myself as a reformer rather than a revolutionary, because I grew up in the 60s, you know, where we thought we were going to really change the world and the church and everything, and now I'm lucky if I can change myself. But we were very optimistic about revolution, and now I'm skeptical that revolution is possible or even desirable. At the same time, I've been a multi-strategy kind of guy. I've delighted in the multiple avenues of achieving political, social, spiritual, and ecclesiastical change represented in the diversity of our community. I think the more strategies, the merrier. I mean, my strategy hasn't worked, so go ahead. You know, whatever strategy you can devise for changing the church and society or religious institutions in society, the more the merrier. The only strategies that are problematic for me, and I say problematic, are those that entail violence, either physical or rhetorical violence. Over the course of the past 25 years, I've also come to understand the enormous, pervasive, and acceptable level of spiritual abuse that religious institutions, particularly the church, visit on all of its participants, especially lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. I think it's important to stress all of its participants, not just those of us in the LGBT community, but in the broader church. Spiritual abuse generates a cycle of violence in which the abused become the abusers. So many of us beat up on each other about religious and spiritual issues. I mean, it's more difficult sometimes for me to say I'm Christian in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender community than to say I'm a gay Christian in the church. And the religious right, of course, and the conservative opposition within our own denominations also beat up on us. But we have to recognize that we are all victims or survivors of spiritual abuse. We've all been beaten up on. There was a woman who had experienced physical abuse who came to one of my retreats, and she said that she had been beaten on the lower part of her back, and her lover did not know about this taboo area of her body, that if somebody even touched her there gently at a social occasion, she would recoil because she carried so deeply the somatic memory of that early childhood experience of being beaten there that she couldn't even be touched there. And her lover started giving her a massage and working down her back. And finally, I was about to come to this spot, and the woman said, I was afraid I'd stand up and run screaming from the room. But because she trusted her lover's tender, loving care brought healing to that area of her body that she had not allowed to be touched, and her lover was able to massage her there. That is the kind of tender, loving care that I think needs to be brought to bear to all victims or survivors of spiritual abuse, whether within our own communities or within the church or within the religious right. We all need tender, loving care, a tender touch. That's why we're so sensitive. We're so sensitive about spirituality that we need to be touched tenderly in our spiritual areas. To describe where I am now, I have to say that I'm spiritually weary of the church. I am spiritually weary of the church. And I'm sexually wary of the church. Many of the things that I find acceptable within our community, that is the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, will never be accepted within the church as long as it holds up monogamy rather than mutuality as its only and highest sexual ideal, as long as it holds up heterosexual intercourse as its definition of sexuality. A little aside here, I don't usually say this in public groups, but it strikes me as interesting that Bill Clinton, who signed the Defense of Marriage Act, I mean, don't they get it from the title, that signed the Defense of Marriage Act absolutely has to believe we don't have real sex. Because if we have real sex, then he was engaged in an adulterous relationship with Monica Lewinsky. But if he believes that oral sex is not real sex, if he believes sex that doesn't involve male and female genitalia directly interacting is not real sex, then he can believe he's been faithful to his spouse. And so suddenly, you know, it's like a window opening up in my mind. I realized this is why American society doesn't want to recognize our sexuality as real, because then they have to say that they have not been faithful to their spouses. Little thing to think about. I And also, I mean, I don't think there are many things in our community that will be accepted as long as the concepts of masculine and feminine are viewed as polar opposites, and pleasure as suspect and distraction to the spiritual life. Presently, I understand myself as a Christian who does not go to church. Jesus is still for me a spiritual authority, but without the sacrificial layers by which we have buried or closeted the divinity that Christ reveals to us. A divinity whose locus is within the body and within creation. A kingdom or spiritual commonwealth of which we are all citizens and to which we are all heirs, which transcends life and death. I find myself increasingly and joyfully detached from the church, even as I'm vitally concerned about its reformation. And I want to close with a quick story. I was co-leading a retreat with Lisa Bove and Howard Warren. Some of you know Howard, a cantankerous, older Presbyterian clergy person, HIV positive, and very outrageous, known as God's glorious gadfly in the Presbyterian Church. And we went out, when we were co-leading a retreat at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, and we went to Taos to see some of the stuff there. We'd never been there. And there was a church I wanted to visit because I'd heard about this famous miraculous painting where Jesus is standing on the shores of Galilee, but when the light goes out, a cross, phosphoresces across his body, and you see a halo above his head, and he seems to be hovering there in midair. But what I thought was even more miraculous was the video leading up to the display of this painting, a video which described the annual reformation, if you will, of this church in which the painting is. It's St. Francis of Assisi Church, Roman Catholic Church in Taos. And you've probably all seen it because Georgia O'Keeffe painted it, and those huge adobe walls. If you've seen any of her paintings of churches, it was probably that particular church. And every year, these adobe walls, the way it's built, it's bricks covered by mud and straw. And every year at the end of the rainy season, the members of the church have to get together and repack the mud and the straw on the brick walls, because the rain, of course, removes some of it. And they sign up, it's like a church potluck. A through C come on Monday, D through F come on Tuesday, and on through a 2-week period so that they can repack the church. Well, somebody's offered them a permanent solution and suggested a stucco-like material, resin, that could cover the walls, and therefore the mud wouldn't go away, and they wouldn't have to annually repack the church. But they found, when they applied this resin, that it kept the walls from breathing. The moisture couldn't go in or out. The bricks inside started to dry out, and they started to crumble, and the walls would have come tumbling down if they didn't remove the resin and return to their annual reformation of the church. And I think that this is a great metaphor of religious institutions, that we think the boundaries have to be fixed, the walls have to be solid, but if they're not permeable to the winds of the Spirit, then our spirituality dies. And I think that this is a great metaphor of how I experience the church and how I hope the church will experience itself.
We can't work in the church, we're going to get our hands in the mud, right? We're sort of working up the traditions here. I just want to give people around. I'm going to invite Craig to speak next, and then Joan, and John. And then we have a surprise and an honor that we'll return to Origins. We have with us Rabbi Tobias Spitzer, who I'm going to invite to speak last, remembering in the Christian scriptures that the last are always first. So now, from a corner of the Christian church that has embraced contradiction and is not at all embarrassed about ambiguity, Bishop Craig Bettendorf, who I found out just minutes ago, being something of a baby Anglican, is part of a movement within the Anglican Church called the Evangelical Anglican Church, headquartered in California, where all good things end up.
Thank you very much, John. First of all, I'd like to speak to the corporate name of the organization that I'm a member and that I am a bishop in, the Evangelical Anglican Church in America, we're often misconstrued as those darned Anglicans that left 20 years ago over the ordination of women or over that funky prayer book, but we're absolutely not. We have taken the word evangelical back from the fundamentalists, just as we now celebrate the word fag and homo and gay in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community. It's very powerful when you get into the original scripture and you get into the focus of what evangelical meant, to take it back and to take it to the streets and to remind the fundamentalists that they are not the only ones with a keen understanding and awareness of this. My own faith journey actually began at baptism. I have a bit of a schizophrenic family history. My father was a Roman Catholic, my mother was a Lutheran, so by God I became an Episcopalian. Meet them right in the middle. Don't know what to believe? Gosh, cash in on that. The church of my choice served me quite well through my college years, but as my sexual orientation kicked in and that I began to affirm it, I realized in the early 1980s that there was not a place at the table for me. So I did what many gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people do. I recoiled, I ran away, and I went into a life in the business world. MBA all the way, baby. That's where you can make impact in life. 15 years later, and after experiencing a marvelous relationship with a man who I still love to this day, the Holy Spirit kicked me in the ass. That's all there is to it. I was so intent on taking my calling and putting it on a shelf or putting it on a wall like a certificate and saying that was me, that is no longer me, that it took a number of very interesting occurrences to occur that made me realize that my calling was in fact probably before my baptism. My calling, according to the Old Testament, was while I was in my mother's womb. And who was I to say no to that? I found myself in a very precarious situation because the church in the United States doesn't really like outspoken homosexuals all that much. So I decided to look abroad, and I realized in my own faith tradition that there were 36 other provinces, and one province had absolutely nothing on the books in regards to homosexuality, that being the Church of the Philippines. So this rather tall, 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, gawkingly Anglican boy became a priest of the Philippine Church and pastored congregations in Los Angeles for a total of 3 years. One thing that I did learn from the Philippine Church and that we have taken into the Evangelical Anglican Church in America is that if you keep your faith simple, if you follow the original blueprint of Christianity found in Acts 2:42, and I know many of you at Harvard will have to look that one up. If you keep it simple and if you keep it direct and you keep it honest, Christianity doesn't have to be the dinosaur that is allegedly dying at the turn of the century. Christianity is new, it is vital, it is exciting. We have core groups across the country right now in which they meet for agape meals, they celebrate Mass, they go out and they do public works, they feed thousands of people at Thanksgiving dinners. The gospel of Jesus Christ, and I know the walls may fall in, is alive and well today, and it is living in the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community. We just have to tap into that and take it back from the fundamentalists. Thank you.
Joan Saniuk is known to many of you in the room who know something of the vibrancy and contribution of Metropolitan Community Church here in Boston, where she has been pastor for 1.5 years, located in Old West Church, one of those great Bullfinch churches down on Cambridge Street. Joan, a joy to have you with us.
How's that? Okay. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me today. My journey is a little different from the ones you've heard so far. Leaving my tradition had to do with homosexuality and had to do with AIDS, It didn't have to do with my coming out. That happened later. I grew up Catholic. I am a second career minister. This is my first parish, and I've been here for about a year and a half, as John told you. In the 70s, going into the ministry as a priest was not an option for me in the Catholic Church. It's still not. Becoming a nun didn't feel right. That wasn't what I was called to. So I did something else. I became an aerospace engineer, ultimately. I taught math. It is easier, I find it easier to be a lesbian, an out lesbian minister than to be a female aerospace engineer. That will tell you something about engineering and sexism in that line of work. I came out of the Catholic Church somewhere in the 1980s. I can't remember exactly when it was I left. I know that although misogyny troubled me, that it wasn't enough to get me out the door. It was becoming friends with a gay man with whom I worked on some justice projects. We fed the hungry, we sheltered the homeless. And when he came out as gay, he had a little acceptance. When he came out as gay and was obviously not celibate, I found some of our religious colleagues in the work were a little less enthusiastic about working with him. And when he got his HIV diagnosis, I found my faith community didn't have anything that it could offer to help me at that time. He's alive and well and making trouble somewhere else in this country right now. Thank God. So that was what pushed me out and into MCC, where I found people who had kind of a Catholic background and an appreciation for a justice-oriented religion, a justice-oriented faith, and a contemporary liturgy that was embodied. In fact, all the things that I cherished, being Catholic and staying Catholic through my experience at a Jesuit university in the 70s. So I thought, this is okay, I can be who I am here. Came into MCC, was well on the way to the process of being ordained when I finally had the guts, and I think in my case it was having worked through internalized homophobia by deciding for myself that it was really okay for my friends, and taking several years to do that, I was finally able to imagine that it might be okay for myself. Met a beautiful woman, fell in love with her. We have been together now 5 years. Came out as a lesbian and everybody said, it's about time. So my issues with the church have been around gender and misogyny, as well as homophobia. The topic of staying or leaving is one that I find I continually engage. Having engaged that topic in the Roman Catholic Church and made the decision, difficult, painful decision to leave, I joined MCC. And as soon as I met people from MCC outside of my local church, I immediately began to re-engage the question of staying or leaving, for a couple of reasons. First of all, is it really possible to have parity for women in a co-gender institution? Are women's issues always subordinate to the issues that are articulated by men in a co-gender institution? A struggle with every co-gender institution. Coming to Boston and trying to identify the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered community has been an incredible experience. The community, are you kidding? The community, no. We have a number of communities, some of which actually talk to each other. It's kind of refreshing when I find that. So that's always an issue. How do we engage everyone's issues and how do we include them? And the other issue is around theology. Having left a place where we disagreed about a few things, I've come into MCC where everybody is from someplace else. Now, I've been in MCC now for 11 years, and when this works, it is a miracle It is a gift. It is incredibly creative, taking something from Catholic, evangelical, Baptist roots and creating something new. It's really wonderful. It proves to me that the Holy Spirit does still care about the church and is still working in the church. Sometimes it doesn't work that seamlessly. So part of what I found myself doing was engaging people who had not worked through, for example, some of the biblical perspectives that I had learned a long time ago. How do we interpret the Bible? There are a gazillion different hermeneutic strategies in MCC. There are a gazillion different Christologies. And we have people who have come in from very liberal and very conservative churches of origin, and sometimes don't even know how to talk to each other because the words don't mean the same thing from different contexts. When I was going through the last part of my preparation, which is an orientation intensive, it's the class I think Bob was referring to earlier, at which when I took it was a 2-week residential program in Denton, Texas. And that was the first thing. I don't do heat very well in the summertime like that. The first day I was there, I wanted to leave. I thought, I am never going to be able to, I've been educated with, I was working on an MA in feminist spirituality. And I'm bringing a feminist consciousness and a feminist commitment, and I think I must be the only person in the room who has it. And I thought about leaving the first day I was there. And every time I did that, something said, no, don't leave. What happened on this occasion was I came down with laryngitis. It was awful. And I tried to talk even through the laryngitis the first 2 days. I was just making a fool of myself. And so I decided to put into action the message that I was getting in my prayer, which was, sit down, shut up, and listen. No matter where we are, whether we stay, whether we leave, we're going to end up dealing with people who are different in some sense. So, if we are to transform the world, we can't do that only hanging out with people who think like us. Wherever we are, the work of transformation is going to entail the very difficult task of engaging people that we don't agree with, engaging people whose behavior we find oppressive, engaging with people we don't understand. Good luck.
Having a hard time restraining my applause after each of your presentations. Our next presenter told me he has laryngitis, but he's going to speak anyways. John McDargh has actually been on the front lines of this movement for a long time. In '69, he became involved with the New York Gay Liberation Movement. So the closer to Stonewall, the closest of any of us, I guess. His 7th book is called A Freethinker's Primer of Male Love. And maybe, Bob, if you and I read it, we had more than our 10% or something like that. But John speaks and writes from the perspective of liberal religion and secular humanism, which is not a swear word. John, I look forward to hearing you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be speaking at the Harvard Divinity School, if a bit strange, as I am a humanist and I've been polemicizing against religion for a good quarter of a century. But let me state where I'm at now, and I'll try to say how I got here. I recently joined the Unitarian Universalist Meeting House in Provincetown, motivated by desire for fellowship. When you're gay, middle-aged, and you move to a tiny town at the edge of the world, it can be a lonely experience. Through the UU, I've become part of a community. I guess I'm the third Presbyterian. At least I was raised as one. and my father became one of the highest ranking laymen in the church. For many years he was head of the Permanent Judicial Committee. I don't think I ever really believed such things as the miracles or the items in the Apostles' Creed, but I did enjoy organ recitals and church dinners, especially those in the German Lutheran Church. They had the best cooks. In my freshman year at Harvard, I attended Memorial Church. I studied philosophy under Raphael Demos. My intellectual horizon broadened, and I became more skeptical. Though still a virgin, I knew I was intensely attracted to other males, and used the resources of a widener to research the topic. Male as with the woman, it is an abomination. Let them both die, they are guilty. End of quote. Going forward, still another millennium and then some, we find all male sex punishable by death in the American colonies. Most of the laws quoted Leviticus. For example, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had as a capital crime, quote, a man who lieth with mankind as he lieth with a woman, end of quote. Both parties were put to death. Connecticut simply cited the exact text of Leviticus 20:13. Moving up to recent times, in the 70s and 80s, Christian fundamentalists openly called for killing gay men. Bumper stickers appeared saying, "Kill a queer for Christ." The moral majority issued a literal declaration of war. A Vatican statement gave backhanded support to violence against gay men. In Brooklyn, the Jewish press, associated with the Lubavitcher movement, reaffirmed its approval of the Levitical death penalty for the abomination of sex between males. New York City Councilman Golden read the full text of Leviticus 20:13 in speaking against the gay rights bill being considered. At the same hearings, Orthodox Jews cheered and applauded at the mention of gay men dying from AIDS. It is painful for gay Christians and Jews to confront traditions that have been so consistently hostile, but it must be done. At a forum in the early 80s, gay scholars critiqued the work of a leading gay Christian revisionist. I said then, this is what I said, it is regrettable one must be harsh on a work with such considerable merit, but dishonesty in a scholar must not be condoned. Boswell's attempts to whitewash the crimes of the Christian church are not innocuous wish fulfillment fantasies. They undercut a basic argument for gay liberation, that our oppression is not due to a spontaneous revulsion on the part of the majority population, but rather to a particular theological tradition, that our oppression is rooted in superstition, that the Judeo-Christian taboo on all male sex is the core of the problem. As a humanist, I believe that the human mind and body are good, and therefore reject religious traditions which regard the human intellect as dangerous and the human body as shameful. Believing in free inquiry, I reject religions which have killed people for such sins as blasphemy and heresy. Believing that ethics should be based on reason, I reject ethics based on primitive taboos. A moral code which condemns men to death for loving each other is a vicious and evil moral code. Gay men and all rational people should demand that the Jewish and Christian religions abandon and repudiate the pernicious and ridiculous taboos of the holiness code of Leviticus. However, that being said, humanists need fellowship as much as anyone else. We should not be forced to play Timon of Athens. In the United States, it's necessary to get along with religionists because that's what almost everybody is. I learned last year that Unitarian Universalism welcomes humanists like myself. We can be part of a fellowship, even a worship service, without having to leave our reason at the door. The Provincetown UU Meeting House is a very mixed bag indeed. Gay, straight, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, humanist, deist, pagan, who knows what else. In an odd sort of way it works. If any of you are in Provincetown, you should come to our Sunday service. And there are onion bagels, cream cheese, and coffee afterwards.
We should recruit for Lutherans. It hadn't been planned this way, but maybe it's the operation of the Spirit that John's presentation on Leviticus is followed by a presentation by a colleague who has to take Leviticus seriously. Rabbi Toby Spitzer has, like Joan, been for the last year and a half, the pastor of a congregation, the chief rabbi of the Reconstructionist Synagogue, Doshai Zedek, which he translated for me as Seekers of Justice. Wonderful name for a community. Toby.
It's a little hard to know where to start. I'm always nervous representing all of Jewish tradition. I mean, you all got 3 Presbyterians, and I got so I'll begin with the caveat. I cannot speak for Orthodox Jewry. I have no experience of it. It's not where I come from. The issues in Orthodox Jewry are quite different than liberal Jewry. And I think Ben was going to make some flyers out on the table. There's a film being shown here at Harvard, or parts of a film in progress with a filmmaker called Trembling Before God, which is about queer folks in the Orthodox and Hasidic communities. It's going to be this Sunday. I'm going to be out of town, unfortunately, but so for people who are interested in that, I would recommend that film. Are there any other Jewish folks here? I'm curious. Okay, just so I know. It's sort of interesting and appropriate you brought up Leviticus, because I was going to. As Jews, we read the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, first 5 books of the Bible every year, and each week is assigned a different section. So we go from the beginning of the year in the fall, go through, and then start again. So we go from Genesis through Deuteronomy, and start again. This week, this Shabbat, tomorrow, is the reading of Achrei Mot Kedoshim, which is Leviticus 18 through 20. So I think it's very appropriate that this is happening here. Part of me wishes I also could throw it out. If I threw it out, though, I'd also have to throw out "Love your neighbor as yourself," which comes just a few verses before, sort of sandwiched in between some of the more difficult parts, and I don't want to throw that out. So I want to come back to text and wrestling with text later. I have to admit, I never ever contemplated leaving Judaism or Jewish life. I'm 36. I graduated from Harvard in 1985, and I say that because although Judaism is a 3,000-year-old tradition and has evolved in major ways over that time, the change in the last 20 to 25 years around issues of gender and sexuality have been enormous, really. So, and I'll try to reflect those in my own experience. I grew up in an somewhat alternative community in Washington, D.C., the Fabrengen Chavurah. It had no rabbi. And it was the early 70s. I don't know if there were probably queer folks there. I don't know if I was aware of it. I was a kid, but it was a place where women and men were completely equal, and a lot of experimental stuff was going on. By the time I got to college in the early 80s, I had no interest in the rabbinate, but by that time there were women rabbis in the Reconstructionist and Reform movements, and actually pretty soon in the conservative movement as well. And that step, I think, of equality of women in Jewish tradition was really the first step towards greater inclusion of gays and lesbians. I think the other thing I need to say that's very important is there really is a tendency to throw Judaism and Christianity together. They're really extremely different, and I just want to say that to you as Christian folks. There are no Judeo-Christians. There were for about 100 years, about 2,000 years ago. They don't exist anymore. And we're not the Old Testament. Old Testament religion is quite, or Hebrew Bible religion is quite different than Rabbinic Judaism. Judaism has never been anti-body or anti-sex. Granted, that sex is always supposed to have been contained in a marriage relationship between a man and a woman, but it was positive. There's never been a tradition of celibacy. There are issues around the body, and there's a lot more work to be done. But again, it's very, very different from my understanding of much of Christianity. And again, I think that's important. We're not dealing with deep ambivalence around sexuality per se, I think, in our tradition. I came out in college in 1983, and I was very strongly Jewishly identified. I wasn't particularly observant. I hadn't been raised religiously observant. I was involved in a socialist Zionist youth movement. I had a friend who said, how can you be a socialist and believe in God? But I did, so I always balanced those parts of me. And it wasn't really until 6 or 7 years later that I began becoming more religiously observant, not in a traditional way, but going to Shabbat services and thinking more about my spirituality. And it was at that point I started thinking about rabbinical school. So by the time I started thinking about rabbinical school in 1990, there were already out gay and lesbian rabbis and bisexuals at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, including someone on the staff, the director of practical rabbinics, who's still there. She's a lesbian. Although at that time I talked with someone who was a lesbian who had graduated from there in 1991, and I just wanted to know what it would be like for a lesbian going to rabbinical school. And she says, look, right now, don't even expect you could work for a congregation. You know, that's just not on the books right now. Who knows in 5 years, but, you know, that's where it is. When I entered rabbinical school in 1992, I had a very quirky class. Half of us were lesbian and gay. So of 12 or 13 people, there were 5 lesbians and 1 gay man. That was not a trend. But that was my experience at rabbinical school. You know, there were 2 straight women in my class. They were the minority. So again, just to give a flavor of my experience. Reconstructionism is the 4th denomination of Judaism. It began in 1968 and is becoming more accepted. We tend to be more traditional Jewishly in certain ways than Reform, but have always been out there in terms of women and gay lesbian issues. When my class graduated 2 years ago in 1997, 3 of us were hired for pulpits out. And that was the first time that people had been hired for pulpits out. And at least 3 congregations had made clear in their hiring process that they were open to gays and lesbians. I only applied to those congregations, and one of them is here. So again, that's just to give you a little flavor of how much things have changed. Today, the Orthodox world, both modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, are the only places where women are still not equal in terms of religious rights, and where homosexuality is a deep problem. Doesn't mean there aren't queer folks there are. And doesn't mean there aren't allies there are. But institutionally, that's a problem. Here in the States, Orthodoxy is about 10 or 12% of American Jews. It's a much different issue in Israel. The conservative movement is getting more open, and it'll get there. It just takes time. They do not yet ordain openly gay and lesbian people. There's no affirmation of gay-lesbian commitment ceremonies. But again, there are a few out conservative rabbis and congregations that are very welcoming of gays and lesbians. So it's moving, it'll get there. The Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement openly ordain gays and lesbians. Our movement's the only one so far to affirm gay-lesbian commitment ceremonies. Reform rabbis can do it just hasn't been affirmed by their rabbinic body. And in general, Judaism is much more decentralized than most Christian bodies, where there is no church. There are, in the conservative movement and Orthodoxy, there is Jewish law that needs to be dealt with, and there are bodies of rabbis to deal with that law, but a lot of things are left to the local discretion of rabbis and lay people. So again, there's less of a power structure to battle in. It's a different realm. When I thought about the question of staying or leaving, it feels very complicated to me, because it's not about belief primarily. It's about my community and my family, and it's hard to imagine leaving that. No, and that's not to say there have not been Jewish gays and lesbians and bi and transgendered folks who have not felt, very estranged from the organized Jewish community and have left, either left Judaism entirely or just found other places to go. But there have been ways to organize around Jewishness or being Jewish that aren't necessarily religious. When I was in the Bay Area for a while, there was something called Dyke Shabbos, and lesbians would just get together once a month on Friday night. So there have been ways to connect to each other. And then I think for a lot of Jews, we all leave it at one point or the other, usually in our 20s, and then come back. So leaving Judaism is very complicated, not just about this. Let's see. So I guess I want to just talk finally and come back to Leviticus a little bit. as I mentioned before, it's really hard for me to imagine leaving Judaism. I don't think I could ever have contemplated it. It would have meant losing my culture. It would have meant losing who I was. And I was lucky, and I know I'm lucky to have been born where I was, to have the family I have, and for all the incredible work that went before me in terms of working in the Jewish community to battle homophobia, which is still a long road to go, but so much has been done since the 1970s that I personally benefited from. So I didn't have to leave, but I also didn't have to become a rabbi, so what's that about? For me, Judaism is about a lot of things. The name of the Torah portion this week is Kadoshim, which means holiness. And for me, being Jewish is about sanctifying the mundane, just sort of the everyday that we do, whether it's sex or eating or money or whatever it is. Judaism is about community, about trying to create communities of justice and love. Judaism is about wonder and joy and contemplation, and Shabbat, about taking a rest. But most fundamentally, I really believe that Judaism is about the ongoing human process of trying to understand and articulate what it is that God wants of us. And that's how I understand the Torah. It's some people's attempt 2,500, 3,000 years ago to understand what God wanted of them. And there's some things that got wrong. And it's extremely painful, and it has led and been used as a cover for the kind of hateful acts that John mentioned. But it's not frozen in time, and that's what Judaism is. It's an ongoing process. The founder of Reconstructionism called Judaism an evolving religious civilization, and I think that's correct. And perhaps the most significant influence on my not leaving Judaism is that I feel myself in a 2,000-year process, beginning with the ancient rabbis, of Jews wrestling with sacred texts, the process of midrash, of discursive inquiry, whereby we can take the words of Torah in all kinds of new directions and even overturn those words when necessary. And to be honest, the ancient rabbis had great audaciousness, great chutzpah. When they needed to change something, they did, but always, and they were changing it according to what was originally intended. I mean, that was their line, they believed it. And they really had absolutely no fear of standing things on the head if that's what the times called for, or if that's where they thought it needed to go. Over the past, 200 years, Judaism has lost much of that audaciousness, and the pace of change in certain ways slowed down. My sense is that we need to really reclaim that, and I think it's been the feminist and gay lesbian sort of revolutions in the past 30 years that have brought much of that audaciousness back into Jewish discourse. So I feel like there is a lot of place within Judaism to stay. I can understand why one would leave the Orthodox world, and again, I'm not an expert there. And there are even places to be a devout Jew and be queer. And I guess my advice to someone struggling to stay or leave, would be certainly to leave a situation or a community where your voice, where your personhood is not heard, is not allowed. But that to join the rest of us, to be part of this transformation that's going on in Judaism, and to really take our place in this 3,000-year-old conversation, because I think what's going to happen is incredible, and it's for the benefit of Judaism. It's not just for the benefit of those of us who are gay, lesbian, bi, or transgendered. I think it's really part of a transformation that's been coming, and that it's our articulation of what God wants of us, and it was never meant to stop 2,000 years ago. So I'm proud to be part of that process.
Oh, I can't share myself. This is for everybody here. I particularly want to thank Ben and Cara for completing, at least making more complete our conversation by taking away from busy life and having with us talk. We have about 10 minutes before we feed our bodies as we've been feeding our spirits, and this could be a time for your questions to any of your colleagues, your observations, or whatever. And we're going to do away with the mic for this. We're just...
It's a Tova. My understanding is that Leviticus was really never applied by the rabbis. They found different reasons not to condemn anyone for same-sex activity. Is that correct? I mean, I've asked this Dan and Lauritsen and a few others, and they've always said to me that it was rabbis went to extenuating circumstances to find reasons not to apply.
The rabbis went to great lengths not to imply any of the death penalty. I mean, there was no, you're supposed to get killed for all kinds of things, according to Leviticus. And they went, including, rebellious children, I mean, not just for sexual things. So as far as I know, it was never applied as law. I mean, on the other hand, there's been deep homophobia. Is it because of Leviticus? Is it, was Leviticus just an expression of that? I don't know. Also, it's hard to say. The Jews have not been in a position to impose the death penalty since the destruction of the kingdom, and so it's partially a moot point. The rabbis, I honestly didn't spend so much time about it. The rabbis were actually obsessed. They were obsessed with categories and keeping things in categories. They were obsessed with what they called androgynous and hermaphrodites, the people who didn't appear to be male or female. Intellectually obsessed, not doing anything about it. They were, so there was definitely, wherever the borderlines got fuzzy. In terms of actual condemnation, there's some very nasty things written by Jewish thinkers over time. I don't know if they had any impact beyond, what they said. Traditional Judaism is incredibly homosocial. The men spend all the time together, the women spend all the time together, and I'm sure there's a huge amount of homosexuality going on. The main thing is if you're married and having kids, no one's going to really bother about it. So for people who can't maintain that charade, I think it's painful and they leave. But otherwise, from what I know, it's there. And if you ever have a chance to see an old movie called The Dybbuk, it was a Polish movie that came out right before World War II. It's about two yeshiva buffers, two young men in yeshiva who are totally in love with each other. It's not sexual, but they're hanging all over each other. But in that world, they can't express it. So what do? They pledge that they have children, and they're one's male and one's female, they'll be married, which happens. They make this vow. But when the children are born, the children don't know each other. They get separated. Anyway, it's just the greatest queer theory thing to look at this movie because they don't know, so that the woman gets married to someone else because the boy is a poor scholar. He dies, and his spirit enters her body. So now you've got this woman with a male spirit in her body. Oh, it's wild. It's horrible. And there's so much sublimated stuff going on in traditional Judaism. But as far as I know, no death penalties were ever carried out. Which doesn't mean life wasn't miserable.
Next turn to a film festival. Go.
Hi, thank you. The title is kind of dichotomous, stay or leave, and none of you seem to feel obliged to stay within those two poles, but I was wondering if you could talk more about ways of strategizing or strategizing ways of staying, since that seems a fairly large category and difficult one. And I'm sure one that varies across the duration. I'm not addressing the question anyway.
I think it was Oscar Wilde who said I would never be a member of any organization that would have me as one. I'm sure he did. At that time, he was speaking about the Church of England being appalled by the Roman Catholic Church trying to come back into power in Britain. I think gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people have a difficult struggle with the thought and the homophobia behind, would they really want me to stay? Is this a place that really wants me? Because we are, by and large, socialized as straight people in queer bodies. It's definitely a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us. Many of us have left because the challenge has become so extreme. But there are those that stay.
Well, I think we have to welcome different responses to the question, and I phrased it that way so we don't talk about tolerance or acceptance or anything like that. It's really welcoming individual responses, and for some people, I spoke about spiritual abuse. For some people, it's like being in any abusive relationship. You decide how much abuse you're willing to take before your own psyche suffers to the point that you no longer feel yourself worthy as a person, as an individual, and that's I think you have to leave before your heart breaks, before you're totally destroyed. Although I empathize with that idea of trying to stay a little bit longer, I've certainly outstayed my welcome. But I think that for some people the church is just too abusive, and they need to find spiritual communities in which they can practice what I call safer spirituality. We talk about safer sex, we need to talk about safer spirituality. And there's some spiritual communities that are safer than others. I represent, well, I don't represent, but I'm the editor of Open Hands, which is a journal for, a magazine for congregations that are welcoming of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people. And these are more, these are better environments than others, but they're not perfect environments either. But I think they are a witness to the broader church about the way they can respond to our community. So those could be options. There are also options. Just this gathering here for me as church. In a way, I do go to church. I come to events like this where I'm with other lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folk, and their supporters and allies and parents and families and friends. And I do enjoy the spiritual community of those gatherings.
Time for me, one last question.
It's a little nebulous, and so hope it makes sense, but Ralph Roberts, Unitarian Universalist minister, and in reading, and I guess this is more directed to those of you on the Christian end of things, in reading a lot of the things coming out now, I'm thinking of Bruce Bauer's book, Stealing Jesus, and the new Bishop Spalding on, Must Christianity Die, or whatever it's called. The thing that I wonder is, why is it folks don't look to Unitarian Universalism as a prototype for how some of the hermeneutical things that have to happen in order to support the work that all of you are doing, those new approaches. Here's a community that's done some of that in its history, and yet I don't find us being referenced as, oh look, here's, sort of don't repeat the mistakes of the past or something. Here's a community that's done that. Why do we not provide useful guidance for that? What is it that sort of, and maybe it doesn't for all of you, but I feel as if, it seems as if we don't even represent something useful to the other persons of faith out there to know how this work starts to happen. And I want to know why that is. And you may not be able to answer that.
Every community has to do it on its own, I think. I mean, I was dismayed, that every denomination had to have their own task force to study homosexuality, produce its own report, or human sexuality. And, we couldn't just borrow from each other and look at each other. But it's a process of taking ownership for the transformation that needs to take place. And to simply reference other works, I mean, certainly people might read the stuff, but the organizations have to do it themselves, the different denominations and the different traditions in order to take ownership. They're not just going to buy a ready-made answer completed in another denomination.
I guess I wouldn't want them to do that, but I'm thinking even along the lines of raising the questions as if they're utterly new. And obviously everybody experiences their own questions as new. And I do see people looking across Presbyterian to Lutheran, Episcopalian to Methodist, and making that great divide over to the unpopular, the black sheep of the family, the cousins over here who, I don't know.
I think maybe we don't tell you enough how much we admire you and how important it is to us to have you around the corner or in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
I even in this place that's so proud of its diversity, I hear little snipes all the time among the traditions. I go in all different directions. I think we have a lot of recovery of abuse of each other, theological abuse of each other to do that transcends any one particular issue. So I'm sure none of us tell each other nearly as often how valuable we've been to each other. And I will take this opportunity as a pastor of a church poised between not quite equidistant from First and Second King's Chapel and Arlington Street to tell you that it's wonderful to have the entire possible spectrum of human belief right here.
I think part of my decision to seek ordination at MCC, and to the extent that am I buying into the patriarchal system, or am I transforming it?